Tonight, we catch up with longtime Cellar Angels friend Andy Schweiger of Schweiger Vineyards. This incredible family business, high atop Spring Mountain, has been producing wine since 1979. And tonight, we dig deep into the release of a Pinot Noir. Sit back, sip episode 137 begins now. My name is Martin Cody, co-founder of Cellar Angels. And if it's Friday, sip happens. This is sip episode 137. Started as a wine community to make certain we all got through the pandemic safely. And it has continued as we now branch out into educational pieces. And tonight will be no different. For those of you, and I do see a bunch of you, Maury, I see Lily, and a whole bunch of folks, Alicia, that are new to Cellar Angels, allow me to acquaint yourself. We started this company in 2010 with a mission to actually change the world with wine. And to do so, we wanted to focus exclusively on the limited production wineries of Napa and Sonoma. And so that is the playground to which we flourish. It is a tapestry unlike any other on the globe for producing wine. And we are privileged and honored to be able to do it on the Cellar Angels website and also weekly with some special guests. Those of you that have not acquainted yourself with the Cellar Angels website, I strongly encourage you to do so. There you will actually see tonight's featured bottle of wine when you click over to Shop Wine and go over to Red Wine. Here we're looking at the Schweiger Vineyards 2020 Pinot Noir from Spring Mountain District. We're going to get into detail about this wine and the AVA in a moment. But I also want to alert all of the Cellar Angels folks, if you haven't even created an account on the Cellar Angels website, please do so. And those of you that have, click over into the My Account section. Don't worry, you won't see all this other stuff up here. I'm an administrator, so I get to see it. And when you click over to the My Accounts section, you will see a new Refer a Friend button here. So you can click on Refer a Friend. You will be able to copy your link, and we really technically don't care what you do with that link. You can blast it out to 50 wine friends via email. If you've got a private Facebook group, you can share it in there. If you want to tweet it to the world, you can share it in there too. But for the month of August, if you send it out to someone and they sign up for Cellar Angels and just merely create an account, we're going to put 500 loyalty points in your account. If that person also happens to sign up for Wine Club, we're going to give you and them a $25 coupon to spend on the site. No limit. So it's a very special opportunity in August to share with some friends. We've got a pretty neat Wine Club coming up in Q3 that'll ship after Labor Day. So the Cellar Angels website is chock full of information. And as I showed you earlier, the Schweiger Pinot Noir, I've got a long story about Schweiger, or a long history, I should say. But those are the folks that are drinking it tonight did so because they purchased this sip kit a while back. So there's currently 4 bottles in this sip kit that are available for the next 4 Friday tastings, August 25th through September 29th. And you can see that we've got Ramsgate, Hoops, I'm excited about that one, Halleck, and it looks like a Kaluna that we're going to be featuring on the Sonoma side. And then also here's the Schweiger that I talked about earlier. By the way, other than the Wine Club and other than the winery, Cellar Angels is the only place you can get this wine. A very limited production, as we'll talk about with Andy in a second. But I mentioned that we have a long history with Schweiger Family Vineyards, and it dates back all the way to 2007, 2008. When we first became aware in the wine shop in Chicago, oddly enough, that they made a mountaintop Chardonnay. And it honestly stopped me in my tracks. First of all, I did not know they made mountaintop Chardonnay. And this one was not the oaky, clawing, buttery Chardonnay that had somehow become synonymous with Napa in the 2000s. But it had some minerality, some crispness, some acidity, and it was stellar fruit. And since that point in time, we have fallen in love with the family, fallen in love with the AVA, fallen in love with the winery, and they still have one of the greatest phrases I've heard in the hospitality business, bar none, let alone the wine hospitality business. And this is from Andy's father, who says, every time you come, we want you to have an experience of a lifetime. And that includes, even if you're up there for your 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th time, which I'm fortunate to have done. And each time it's magical. And the person now behind that magic running the day-to-day operation is this evening's guest. So without further ado, let me bring in Andy Schweiger from his home up. I don't even know where you live, Andy.
I live in town.
Okay, it's St. Helena.
I love my parents. I love my job, but I realized shortly after my wife and I got married that, yeah, let's live off property.
Smart move. Yeah. Cheers. Good to see you.
Likewise. And thank you, everybody, for jumping in this evening. Hope many of you are going to be able to enjoy this Pinot while we're talking.
Yeah, and enjoy is interesting because right during the pre-show, I was telling Andy, and we just opened it for the first time. It's blowing me away, and we're going to get into why a Pinot on top of a mountain in an AVA that's not known for Pinot. But I want to kind of start, Andy, early on. But first, I have to go back 1 second. And Monday's pop quiz, Spring Mountain District AVA's elevation above sea level and the year it was established. B, the answer is 2,600 feet and 1993. Doug R. If Doug is in the house, Doug, or he could be at the symphony. I don't see Doug, but I do see Izzy, who knows Doug, but I don't know if we can give Izzy partial credit. So maybe Doug. Second is Julie Fogarty. Julie F. Is Julie in the house? I'm not certain Julie is either. So then it's going to go to Sandra O. And I did see Sandra O. So congratulations, Sandy. And 100 points being deposited in your account. But the Spring Mountain AVA, Andy, you've called home for most of your adult life. And you grew up in the vineyards behind me. From a very young age. Tell us a little bit about kind of when you started taking over the reins from your dad, making wine, and your vision for the winery today.
Sure. Well, it's funny because I actually did an interview with the St. Helena Star earlier this week, and one of their questions was, well, why did you choose to grow wines in the Spring Mountain District? It's like, well, I think it shows me because we've been up there longer than it's been an AVA.
Right.
So it is interesting because, now it is sought after and people will, intentionally buy fruit just so they can put that on their label. And it's like, yeah, you're welcome. We did the hard work for you. So I guess if we go all the way back, you are probably very well aware of the old story that the best way to make a small fortune in the wine industry is start with a large one. We've never had either one of those. Rather, my dad was working for CAL FIRE, and he was transporting some engines from Sonoma County over to Napa County, and he saw this property for sale. Had enough to pay $225 an acre. The property owner was asking $275 an acre. So handshake compromise, the property owner took it off the market for a year. And when dad had saved up enough money to pay $250 an acre, bought the property. Now, at that time, it was completely forested. That's a beautiful older picture behind you there, Martin, because the trees were all still green. But you look at how that forest perimeter is behind the winery there. That is how all the property used to be. And growing up in the 70s, we'd go hiking for Christmas trees up there.
Wow.
That wasn't until... I'm about to have a visitor. It wasn't until the 70s, dad is in construction, recession hit, and interest rates shoot over 20%. Not a good time to be in the custom home building business. So dad somehow convinces my mom that, a vineyard could be a fun hobby, just 2 or 3 acres until the next job comes along. 35 acres, next job came along. Now, it's interesting to note, and I have to be careful how I say this because sometimes people get all up in arms about cutting down trees, but cutting down trees is part of progress. And if you're cutting down one tree to replace with 10 grapevines, it's not like you're building condos. But granted, interest rates were sky high. We couldn't get a loan to do the job. So to buy the vines, to buy the wire and the stakes for the trellis system, we did have a timber permit. So we were earning money by selling the trees we were cutting and turned that money right back around into the land to buy the vines and buy the trellis equipment. Sometimes people ask why our vineyard rows are spaced the way they are. And it's kind of funny that most often you ask somebody that question, they'll say, oh, well, I read this from this vineyard management company, or I was recommended to do this, or all of our neighbors were doing this. In our case, we already had a Caterpillar D2, and so the vine spacing was designed around the tractor that we have.
But let me pause for a second there, because first you mentioned $250 an acre. Out of curiosity, what would an acre on Spring Mountain, within a mile or two of you, go for today of rough land?
Developed or undeveloped?
Undeveloped.
Undeveloped, probably about 120 to 180,000.
And what about something with vines already?
Depending on the health of the vines, anywhere from 250 to 350.
And you also said interest rates were kind of high. Now, historically speaking, I think we've been a little spoiled over the last 15, 20 years as it relates to interest rates, maybe even longer if you go further back. How high were interest rates back then?
21 to 23%.
Yeah, it's incredible. 21 to 23%. And so you weren't even in the picture yet, were you, when they were doing all this and planting the rows, or were you knee high?
Well, I was a kid. I was, 7 or 8. I was aware of what was going on. My wife and I had been married for about a year and a half, and she signed us up to play softball, and she just assumed I knew how. And I never played baseball or softball as a kid because I was busy working the vineyard. So yeah, I can't throw a softball to save my life, but by the age of 9, you show me where you want that tree to fall and I can make the tree fall there. So I'm a lumberjack, and that's okay.
There you go. And so when did you kind of, leave college or finish college and then come and work at the winery full time?
Well, so when I was 16, I got a fake ID to get a work permit that said I was 18, and started working as a cellar rat in high school, and fell in love with the production side of winemaking. But had grown up farming alongside Dad. I had worked to get my ag driver's license when I was 14. So most of junior high, today would be called middle school, but most of middle school and high school, I would miss 50 to 80% of school the first 4 to 6 weeks of of the school year, because I was the only Spanish speaker in the house. And so I had to go up and translate with the vineyard workers for Dad. And by then, excuse me, he would have a new construction job going. So he necessarily couldn't be there every day during harvest. So at age 14, 15, 16, I was running the picking crews and then driving 8 ton at a time down the road to deliver to wineries. And seeing what was going on inside the wineries, I was like, you know what, this looks like a lot of fun. I had shown a good propensity for chemistry and was like, okay, here's kind of applying what I'm strong at. And it also kind of run the math and realized that, yeah, the vineyard is good for income for mom and dad and us kids, but Dad still had to have the construction as a side hustle to keep all the, get ready for kids going off to college. How is that going to be as my sister and I get older and we get married and we have families? So now it's having to support 3 families. And it occurred to me, this business is going to have to grow in some direction for us to be able to feed more mouths with it. Mm-hmm. So I decided to go off to Davis to study both viticulture and winemaking, and worked for many wineries while going to school because I had chosen Davis over Fresno. Fresno has a stronger practical background. Davis is more theoretical. I chose Davis for the theoretical education because you can always do practical on your own. You can't really do theoretical with OJT. So I get out, it's 93, and working at Chateau St. Jean. 94, we were selling grapes to many different wineries, one of them being Con Creek, which early in 94 had been bought by US Tobacco. And we were on a great price formula, which meant if they were selling Cabernet for $18 a bottle, you got $1,800 a ton. If they were selling it for $30 a bottle, you got $3,000 a ton. So we were going into their $40 program. Well, US Tobacco held a meeting of all the growers, and essentially in the first 2 minutes of the meeting, it came down to, we don't care what your contract says. Nobody is getting more than $900 a ton.
Whoa.
We're US Tobacco. Sue us. We're used to it. You'll go broke in court.
You got to like capitalism sometimes.
Yeah.
Hold that thought, because I don't want you to mention any other winery names, because I've got a poll question. So I'm going to launch a poll question, and this is going to come back in a moment, and you'll know why. But one of the earliest lessons Andy learned about making wine was when he worked at Cain Vineyard and Winery. Cain spelled wrong. Beringer, good help is hard, Andy. I'm not certain who misspelled Cain. Beringer, Stag's Leap, or Chateau Montelena. So where did Andy work as a young lad to pick up a very pivotal piece of wisdom that has served him well to this day? And as I pause and we cue the music, I'm going to take a sip of this 2020 Pinot Noir. All right. So I'm going to go 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, half. All right. Before I share the results, who was the risk taker that went with Cain spelled wrong? Reveal yourself in the webinar chat. Whoever, knowing true Sipsters fashion, there'll be 2 people that claim it. But I want to see who is the honest person that chose Cain, because you are in fact correct. Scotland. Very good. Scotland has, and Lily both have amazing palates, are great wine people. So that is correct. And if you would, Andy, and then I'll revert back to it later when we get to the Pinot Noir, who was the winemaker and what did you learn?
Chris Howell. And I'd say 2 important, and you know what? And let's give a quarter credit to people who said Beringer.
Okay.
Because I worked at Chateau St. Jean before it was a Beringer property.
There you go. And by the way, extra credit. Does anybody know what Stag's Leap and Chateau Montelena have in common? You can throw that in the chat. And show of hands here in the audience, who hasn't been to Schweiger? Ivy, you've not been to Schweiger. Interesting. Scotland again. Scotland's on fire. Yes, both of those wineries were in the Judgment of Paris, which is actually next week's SIP topic. So go ahead. We'll give those people partial credit. So Chateau St. Jean.
Oh yeah. So, but anyway, so you were asking me about the lesson learned at Cain, and I'm assuming you're talking about what we discussed yesterday. But I'll throw out 2 things. Is that spoiler alert? Are we going to discuss any other wineries, or am I free to name names again?
You're free to name names. Thank you, though.
Yeah, one of my jobs while in college worked 2 harvests for Joseph Phelps, and that Phelps experience got my foot in the door at St. Jean, where they were starting a Bordeaux blend program, and they said, "Well, hey, you know what? This guy has some Phelps experience. He's familiar with Insignia. Why don't we add him to the winemaking team to help us make the early vintages of this project wine," which I had to go into a marketing meeting and got ticked off in the marketing meeting because it was just blah, 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 blah. And after an hour, they were just talking about what to call the wine, even though none of them had named the wine yet. And I just said, "This is stupid. Just call it 5 varietals in French." And I stormed out. And yeah, lo and behold, Saint-Cepage got its name.
Oh my God.
But yeah, eventually Cain had hired a headhunter to find somebody to take over day-to-day winemaking for Chris, because Chris had to wear many hats as general manager there and supervising many acres of vineyard.
Yes.
So I was hired to take over day-to-day operations at Cain. And, that kind of short trigger attitude of mine carried over, and I'd have to go to marketing meetings, or we'd be talking about accounting or budgets. And I'm like, "Chris, just let me make the wine." And he said, "Andy, there is no winemaking decision. That's not a marketing decision. That's not a financial decision. That's not a economic decision. So grow up and come to the meeting." I don't think he actually said grow up, but
might have said shut up, or yeah, no, it's funny because Chris I can't remember now. I mean, I think he started at Cain in 91, taking over winemaking operations, and has whatever the math is now, 40 some odd vintages under his belt, or 30 some odd vintages under his belt there.
Maybe that put us at 35, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy tenure. I mean, there's very few. Jonathan Emmerich at Silverado, I know. Tom Rinaldi, who's not at a particular winery now, is 47 or so. So that's some tenure. So you're in some good company there. And he's a neighbor.
Yeah, exactly. And they are going to be rebuilding. So
good. So you took over the reins full-time making wine in 93?
Oh yeah. So let me, so let's walk that back. So we have the U.S. tobacco story. So we're hosed, except there is a rider in our contract that if we need the fruit that's contracted to them for our own winery production, we can get out of the contract. So mom and dad went down, pulled a winery use permit, and called me up and said, don't quit your day job because we can't afford to pay you anything, but we need to make wine this year and we don't know how. It's a misconception that, I learned the winemaking from my dad. And actually very early on, my dad said, look, I know I don't know winemaking. I just know I grow great grapes. So none of that Mickey Mouse blending you do at other wineries, just 100% Cabernet, 100% Merlot. And 94 was our first year. We had no equipment and we had no barrels. We had nothing. That first vintage, we were sanding down. We used to do a lot of harvesting in the mild steel 2-ton valley bins. And so sanded those down and painted them with food grade white paint and fermented in picking bins. Eventually bought some 1/2-ton bins. Eventually, as we could afford, we that first harvest rented a distimmer. Rented whenever we could get a press, and we were kind of at the mercy of the rental market. And every year we would try and find used equipment. And as we grew and started selling wine and getting some money, we invested it back in the winery. So this will be our 30th vintage, and we've gone through 3 different distimmers. We've had 2 different presses. And it's just a matter of, okay, you know what? I'm not really happy with this one. I'm pretty happy with what we've got going on right now. But it's, we're one of the few wineries, I think, that reinvests very actively in our production space and in our equipment. You go to a lot of smaller wineries and they look run down and the equipment isn't well cared for. Well, our 10-wheeler, the truck I used to drive to deliver the fruit, we bought that used, and it actually had a sticker in it. This truck pays your salary. Take care of it like you do your paycheck. And that's what I do with our equipment, whether it's something used that we purchased. Our first press was designed for apple cider, and it was imported from Italy. The gentleman who had bought it was feeling ill the day it arrived at his property, and he passed away 2 weeks later. So it sat in a barn unused for over 15 years. And mom and dad went down with the trailer without having seen it first, bought it and brought it home and said, okay, so this is right before the 95 harvest, and said, okay, we bought you a press.
The 94 harvest being the first one, then 95, and you're starting to kind of, for a long time, my guess would be the production facility was the island of misfit toys. It was just things from, type of stuff. Was there ever a point where young Andy with the short fuse and wanting to do things in a more grandiose style were just like, son of a gun, when are we going to start getting our act together? Or conversely, were you just absolutely smitten to be making wine and you didn't care?
I appreciated what I had. But, I also realized that, there were limitations to what we had. So sure, from 94 to 95, we went from having to rent distimmers and load all the wine in and take it down at Cain to be pressed off.
That's not an easy drive, by the way.
No, especially when you've got wine sloshing in the back of the truck. This isn't grapes anymore. This is actually, liquid with skins. Yeah. Granted, we had done our best to drain it off, but yeah, it's not easy. So now all of a sudden new vintage, we have our own equipment. But there's learning curves, but you just have to embrace it. It's like, hey, at least I have this. Now, I should say it's kind of funny. We did not know this press was built in the 70s over in Italy. And I did a little research. I mean, granted, you couldn't Google back then, but I'm like, okay, well, what kind of paint is on this? It was like avocado green. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is lead-based paint.
100%.
So the very first thing we did is I called up some of my fraternity brothers and we put on face masks and we sanded it down to bare metal and painted it with food grade latex. And then I'm not an electrical engineer, but I slept last night at a Holiday Inn, so I feel well prepared to conquer things like that. Yep. And that's when I learned about the difference between 60 hertz that we have here in the United States and 50 hertz that they use over in Europe. And this could be a trivia question. What happens when you run a 50 hertz piece of machinery on a time clock on 60 hertz American?
I promise you, Jeff G knows. And if he has a cocktail in his hand, he's going to put it down and type it in, because the man is a wizard. And when he was here at our house, he helped me take off the microwave panel and we had to solder some pieces back together in there and fix that. Thankfully, it was the American voltage. But what does happen?
A minute has 50 seconds. So where this becomes interesting is that it actually had no control panel. It had a punch card reader, and it came with 2 plastic punch cards. And there we go. It all speeds up.
There's so many things I can go to right now with regards to a minute, but I'm not going to digress. Yeah. It's all good. So it all speeds up.
What I wound up doing is I had to take these punch cards and before harvest and just run the punch cards and see, okay, what does this section do? What does this section do? Because I don't speak or read Italian. And so I just start writing on a Sharpie, when it engages this part of the program, it does this. And so then I would just, when it was time to press during that 95 vintage, I'd feed in the punch card and say, okay, I want it to do this. So I'd manually pull it through the punch card reader until it got to the section where I wanted to do, and then stop, and then it would do its thing. So
see, this is a hard business. This is where fractions and time and minutes could make or break a vintage.
Yeah. And they say necessity is the mother of invention. And, I was very happy at the time to have what we had, but then, finally I was like, hey, we're limited by this. And so it was in 2000, we finally purchased a Europress, which is what I had been using over at Cain. And it was, I even floored my dad because I chose not to have the computer controls. I went all for manual switches because to me, I think if something is too computer controlled, you lose the touch of being there in the moment, tasting it. It's too easy. I've worked at too many wineries where you just, put in this program and then they walk away.
Right.
I like being there to have manual control, which I know my family would laugh at me because I'm all about home automation. Our adopted son comes home from New York sometimes and he's like, Papa Andy, someday this house is going to rise up and kill you. But you know what? When it comes to my work, you can't be automated. You've got to be there. I'm tasting the whole time I'm pressing, and you've just got to be there and you got to be involved.
So was 2000 or shortly thereafter, was there ever a period of time where you felt like, okay, we've arrived, we are now a real winery, we've got production, we've got barrels, we've got a press, or are you still working towards that?
I think every year I never want to be complacent. It is interesting. We did, so our barrel room is under the tank room and underneath the tasting room area. And the tank room floor is over 20 years old now. And so it's a floating floor, and it's developed cracks over time. And, concrete will allow water to seep in. And the continued concern was we've got many, many ton of rebar in that floor. And if that starts to